Still preserved in the Louisiana State Archives is the marriage certificate, yellowed and brittle, bearing the names of Jeremiah Aldrich and Celeste, listed simply as property beneath his signature. What renders this document so deeply unsettling isn't merely the grotesque nature of a union between a plantation owner and his enslaved cook, but the 13 mysterious deaths that unfolded in the months following their wedding ceremony in March 1854. Local newspapers from that era, carefully preserved in private collections, allude to a conspiracy so elaborate and cruel that authorities buried the investigation to shield some of Louisiana's most prominent families. Behind this forced marriage lies a web of betrayal, revenge, and systematic torture that managed to shock even the violence-hardened antebellum South. Before we continue with the story of Jeremiah Aldrich and the hellish fate that awaited him at Willowbrook Plantation, be sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. Now, allow me to transport you back to a time when honor meant everything, and when broken trust could destroy a man in ways far worse than death. The events leading to that unholy marriage began 15 years earlier in the murky backwaters of the Mississippi Delta, where fortunes were forged in human flesh and blood money flowed as freely as the muddy river itself. Jeremiah Aldrich was not born into the plantation aristocracy that defined Louisiana society in the 1840s. The son of a failed tobacco farmer from Kentucky, he arrived in New Orleans in 1839 with nothing but ambition burning in his chest and a willingness to engage in business that more established gentlemen wouldn't touch with their finest gloves. The slave trade, while legal, carried a social stigma among the old Creole families, who preferred to maintain the fiction that their wealth came from sugar and cotton alone, not from the systematic buying and selling of human beings. It was during the sweltering summer of 1840 that Aldrich formed his partnership with Marcus Deveau and Samuel Rochelle, two men whose desperation matched his own ruthless ambition. Deveau, the youngest son of a declining sugar baron, needed funds to rescue his family's crumbling plantation from creditors. Rochelle, a former ship captain who'd lost everything to yellow fever and bad investments, possessed invaluable knowledge of the illegal slave routes from Cuba and the Caribbean islands. Together, they established what they called the Delta Trading Company. Operating from a warehouse on the outskirts of New Orleans, where the law's reach grew thin and questions weren't asked about the source of their merchandise, the business proved more profitable than any had dared imagine. While legitimate slave traders dealt in documented property with clear titles and health certificates, Aldrich's operation specialized in what they euphemistically called recovery services. They purchased enslaved people who had escaped from failed plantations, bought kidnapped free blacks from corrupt bounty hunters, and, most lucratively, smuggled fresh captives from illegal ships that still crossed the Atlantic despite the official ban on the international slave trade. Their profit margins were extraordinary because operating costs were minimal. They cared nothing for the health, housing, or basic humanity of their merchandise. For 3 years, the partnership flourished in the shadows of New Orleans society. They reinvested their profits into legitimate businesses, buying respectability along with property. Deveau saved his family's plantation and expanded it into one of the most productive sugar operations in St. Charles Parish. Rochelle purchased a fleet of riverboats and became a respected shipping magnate. Aldrich himself acquired Willowbrook Plantation, a modest but profitable cotton operation about 40 miles upriver from New Orleans, complete with a grand colonial mansion that announced his arrival into Louisiana's planter elite. But success bred carelessness, and carelessness attracted attention from people who mattered. In the spring of 1843, word reached them that federal marshals were investigating illegal slave trading operations along the Gulf Coast. Someone had been asking questions about their business, examining shipping records, and, worst of all, interviewing some of their former merchandise who had managed to escape or gain freedom through other means. The three partners met in emergency session in Aldrich's new study at Willowbrook, surrounded by leather-bound books he couldn't read and oil paintings of ancestors who weren't his own. Suffocating tension filled the room as each man realized their empire of human misery was about to collapse. Deveau, always the most nervous, suggested they dissolve the partnership immediately and destroy all records. Rochelle, with his sailor's pragmatism, argued for a more measured approach, shifting assets offshore and waiting for the investigation to pass. But Aldrich had a different solution, one that revealed the true depths of his moral bankruptcy. He had already decided to eliminate his partners and steal their combined assets. He needed a plan that would remove suspicion from himself while silencing the two men who knew enough to destroy him. The solution came to him with the cold clarity of pure evil. He would murder both men and arrange the scene to suggest they had killed each other in a dispute over money. With Devo and Rochelle dead, he would be the sole survivor of a tragic business disagreement, free to disappear the evidence while keeping all their accumulated wealth. The murder took place on a humid evening in June 1843 at the warehouse that had served as their base of operations. Aldrich had arranged the meeting under the pretense of planning their exit strategy. He chose the location carefully. The district was largely abandoned after sunset, and the building itself was scheduled for demolition the following month. Aldrich arrived early, concealing a loaded pistol in his coat and a razor-sharp skinning knife in his boot. His plan was brutally simple: shoot Devo first, then stage a knife fight with Rochelle that would end with both men dead and him claiming self-defense. He had even prepared false witnesses, 3 men hired from the docks, who would swear they'd seen Devo and Rochelle arguing violently earlier over missing money. When his partners arrived, they found Aldrich already seated at their usual planning table, a bottle of expensive whiskey and 3 glasses arranged between stacks of ledgers. The conversation began normally, with Devo reviewing the legal threats and Rochelle outlining a plan to transfer assets to banks in Havana. But as the evening wore on, Aldrich steered the discussion toward their accumulated wealth, specifically the location of hidden cash reserves. It was Rochelle who first sensed something wrong. The old sailor's instincts picked up on subtle changes, the way Aldrich's eyes never quite met theirs, how his hand kept drifting toward his coat pocket, the tension in his voice when he asked about account numbers. When Rochelle suggested they postpone and reconvene with lawyers present, Aldrich knew his window was closing. The violence erupted with shocking suddenness. Aldrich drew his pistol and fired directly into Devo's chest before the younger man could react. The shot echoed through the empty warehouse, and Devo collapsed backward, blood spreading across his white shirt. But Rochelle, despite being caught off guard, proved more resilient. The former sea captain overturned the heavy table and lunged forward with a broken whiskey bottle, slashing a deep gash across Aldrich's left cheek, a wound that would leave a permanent scar. What followed was a desperate, 10-minute struggle, far longer than Aldrich had planned. Rochelle fought with the fury of a man who understood exactly what was happening. They crashed through crates, scattered ledgers, and left blood trails on every surface. In the end, it was Rochelle's age that betrayed him. At 53, he couldn't match the younger man's endurance. Aldrich finally drove the blade deep into Rochelle's stomach, twisting it upward. But even as he died, Rochelle gasped out haunting words: "My son knows everything. He'll come for you. When he's old enough, he'll make you pay." At the time, Aldrich dismissed this as the ravings of a dying man. He had no idea that Marcus Devo's younger brother, Philippe, had been secretly documenting their illegal activities, or that Samuel Rochelle's 17-year-old son, Henri, possessed detailed knowledge of every transaction and crime the Delta Trading Company had committed. Aldrich spent the next 4 hours methodically arranging the crime scene. He placed Devo's body to suggest he'd been shot while reaching for a weapon, positioned Rochelle nearby with a bloody knife, and scattered money to imply a financial dispute. He damaged the office safe, inflicted wounds on his own hands and arms, and ensured his false witnesses performed as paid. They testified to police that they'd seen Devo and Rochelle arguing earlier about missing partnership funds. A corrupt dock worker claimed he'd heard shouting, followed by gunshots and a struggle. Aldrich claimed he'd arrived to mediate the dispute, only to walk into a deadly confrontation. The New Orleans police, overwhelmed and eager to close a case involving 3 relatively respectable businessmen, accepted his version with minimal investigation. The official report concluded that Devo and Rochelle had killed each other in a business dispute, with Aldrich barely escaping the same fate. Within a week, the warehouse was demolished as planned, destroying any remaining evidence. With his partners dead, Aldrich moved quickly to consolidate their wealth. He presented himself as the surviving partner of a legitimate shipping company, producing carefully forged documents showing Devo and Rochelle had agreed to transfer their shares to him upon their deaths. Banks accepted the word of a single plantation owner with documented cotton production success. Over the following months, Aldrich systematically emptied every account, safe deposit box, and hidden cash reserve belonging to his murdered partners. He estimated the total value at nearly $40,000, a fortune worth over $1 million today. More importantly, he had eliminated the only two people who could connect him to the Delta Trading Company's illegal operations, leaving him free to reinvent himself as a respectable member of Louisiana society. But Aldrich had made a fatal miscalculation. In his obsessive focus on immediate threats and financial gain, he had completely ignored the families of the men he murdered. Specifically, he failed to consider that both Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle had younger relatives who would soon learn the truth and spend the next decade carefully, methodically, patiently planning a revenge so elaborate and devastating that death would seem like mercy by comparison. Philippe Devo was 22 when his brother Marcus was murdered. Unlike the older Devo men, Philippe possessed a calculating intelligence that made him far more dangerous than Aldrich ever imagined. As Marcus's closest confidant and unofficial business manager, Philippe had maintained detailed records of every Delta Trading Company transaction, coded ledgers documenting illegal slave purchases, shipping manifests from prohibited routes, and, most damning, correspondence with corrupt officials. More importantly, Philippe had never trusted Jeremiah Aldrich. Something about the Kentucky newcomer's eagerness to engage in the most brutal aspects of their business struck him as excessive. He had begun investigating Aldrich's background months before the murders, discovering inconsistencies in his stated history and financial irregularities. When news of Marcus's death reached him, his first reaction wasn't grief, but cold, calculating fury. The official story made no sense to anyone who actually knew the partners. Marcus was fundamentally cautious. Rochelle resolved disputes through negotiation, not knife fights. Most telling, Aldrich's account contained details Philippe knew to be false. Within days of the funeral, Philippe began his own investigation. Using contacts from his brother's network, he interviewed dock workers, examined records, and bribed police. He discovered the crime scene had been staged, witnesses had been paid, and crucial evidence had been overlooked or destroyed. Most importantly, he learned Aldrich had begun accessing his murdered partner's financial assets within hours of their deaths. Meanwhile, Henri Rochelle was conducting his own investigation from a different angle. At 24, Samuel's son possessed his father's maritime connections combined with a formal education in law and business. Henri had spent years working in New Orleans banks and shipping companies, building relationships with clerks and officials. His investigation revealed the true scope of Aldrich's theft: over $60,000 in cash, property, and business investments, wealth built on the suffering of hundreds. But what made Henri truly dangerous was his understanding of Louisiana's financial and legal systems. Unlike Philippe, who focused on proving guilt through direct evidence, Henri realized a more effective approach would be to use Aldrich's own greed against him. He began developing a plan to systematically destroy Aldrich's financial foundation, leaving him vulnerable to the same betrayal and violence he had inflicted. The two young men met for the first time in the fall of 1844, more than a year after the murders. The meeting took place at a discreet restaurant in the French Quarter. What neither expected was how perfectly their different skills complemented each other, or how completely their shared desire for justice would consume the next decade of their lives. By the spring of 1845, Philippe Devo and Henri Rochelle had transformed their individual quests into a carefully coordinated conspiracy designed to destroy Jeremiah Aldrich through the same methods he had used: betrayal, financial manipulation, and violence disguised as legitimate business. But unlike Aldrich's impulsive brutality, their approach would be methodical, patient, and absolutely devastating. The first phase focused on infiltrating Aldrich's social and business networks. Philippe, using his family's remaining connections, began frequenting the same clubs and events where Aldrich was establishing himself. His goal was to study the man's habits, weaknesses, and financial vulnerabilities. Within months, he had positioned himself as one of Aldrich's casual acquaintances. Meanwhile, Henri used his banking connections to trace every aspect of Aldrich's financial empire. He discovered the plantation owner's apparent wealth was built on risky investments, leveraged loans, and ventures that generated short-term profits but created long-term liabilities. Most crucially, Henri learned Aldrich had developed a serious gambling problem, regularly losing thousands in high-stakes poker and horse racing, funding it through desperate borrowing against future crops. The gambling addiction gave them the perfect opening. By 1848, Henri had secured employment with the First National Bank of New Orleans, the institution holding the primary mortgage on Willowbrook Plantation. From this position, he subtly manipulated Aldrich's credit arrangements, ensuring loan renewals came with slightly higher rates, payment schedules created cash flow problems, and the plantation owner was gradually pushed toward financial desperation. Simultaneously, Philippe cultivated relationships with New Orleans's most notorious gambling operators. Through carefully placed bribes, he arranged for Aldrich to be invited to increasingly expensive games where other players secretly worked together to ensure the plantation owner would lose far more than he could afford. Their approach was patient and subtle. Rather than confronting Aldrich directly, they were systematically destroying the financial foundation supporting his social position. Every loan due created stress, every gambling loss deepened his desperation, every failed risky investment pushed him closer to complete ruin. By 1851, their efforts showed results. Aldrich's debts had grown to nearly $30,000, with interest payments consuming most of his plantation's annual profits. He had been forced to sell land to cover gambling losses, and rumors circulated that Willowbrook was in serious trouble. More importantly, Aldrich's personality showed the strain. He had become short-tempered, suspicious, and increasingly desperate. But Philippe and Henri were not content with mere financial ruin. Their ultimate goal was to subject Aldrich to the same humiliation and terror their murdered relatives had experienced. They wanted him to understand his prosperity was built on blood, his respectability a fiction, and that justice had finally found him. The final phase required pushing Aldrich beyond financial desperation into a position where he would be forced to accept whatever terms they offered, no matter how degrading. They needed him trapped so completely that death would seem preferable to the alternatives, yet alive long enough to appreciate the sophistication of their vengeance. It was Henri who conceived the idea of using Aldrich's own enslaved people as instruments of his destruction. Every plantation owner lived in constant fear of slave rebellion, a fear that could be exploited. But rather than inciting an actual uprising, Henri suggested a more subtle approach. They would use Aldrich's marriage to one of his own enslaved people as the ultimate humiliation, a public degradation that would destroy his social standing while leaving him legally powerless to escape. The selection of Celeste was not random. Philippe and Henri had spent months studying everyone at Willowbrook Plantation, looking for someone whose forced marriage would create maximum social damage while providing a reliable means of controlling Aldrich's fate. Celeste met all their requirements. At 38, she was a large woman, but her size was the least remarkable thing about her. What made her invaluable was her intelligence, her loyalty to her own survival, and, most importantly, her absolute hatred for Jeremiah Aldrich. Unlike many who hid their true feelings, Celeste never concealed her contempt. Her hatred had deep roots. Purchased by Aldrich in 1847, she had been separated from her husband and 3 children, sold to different owners. When she begged him to at least purchase her youngest daughter, Aldrich laughed and said he was running a plantation, not an orphanage. For 7 years, Celeste endured the daily humiliation of preparing elaborate meals for the man who destroyed her family. She watched him entertain guests with stories of success, knowing his wealth was built on stolen money and murder. She cleaned blood from his clothes and saw him burn documents during desperate attempts to hide his financial troubles. More importantly, she accumulated detailed knowledge of his routines, habits, health problems, and growing paranoia. This knowledge made her the perfect ally for anyone seeking to manipulate or harm her owner. The approach to Celeste required delicate handling. They used intermediaries, free people of color who worked in New Orleans markets and had legitimate reasons for occasional visits to plantations. Through these contacts, they gradually established communication, initially offering small amounts of money for information. What they discovered exceeded expectations. Celeste not only possessed detailed knowledge of Aldrich's vulnerabilities, but she had been conducting her own subtle campaign of psychological warfare for years, deliberately oversalting his food, breaking his favorite items, spreading rumors among the other enslaved about his financial troubles and plans to sell them. When Philippe and Henri finally revealed their true identities and plans, Celeste's response was immediate. She would do whatever was necessary to help destroy the man who had murdered their relatives and ruined her life. Her only condition was freedom and safe passage to Canada, where she hoped to locate her surviving children. They agreed immediately. The final details took shape over months. Aldrich would be pushed into complete financial ruin through manipulated gambling losses and called loans, leaving him vulnerable to an offer he could not refuse: marry Celeste in a legal ceremony or face immediate death at the hands of his creditors. The marriage would destroy his social standing and provide Philippe and Henri legal access to his property through their control of his wife. Most importantly, it would place Celeste in a position to gradually poison Aldrich over several months, causing him a slow, agonizing death. But the plan required precise timing. They needed Aldrich's financial collapse to coincide with a period of isolation. The opportunity came in early 1854 when Henri learned Aldrich planned to attend a high-stakes gambling tournament in New Orleans, hoping to win enough to save his plantation from foreclosure. It would be the perfect moment to spring their trap. The gambling den was located in a converted warehouse near the New Orleans waterfront. The February evening in 1854 was humid and oppressive, with fog shrouding the streets. Aldrich entered carrying a leather satchel containing $8,000, nearly every liquid asset he could scrape together. What he didn't know was that Philippe and Henri had orchestrated this moment for months, ensuring every other player would work together to strip him of his remaining wealth. The game was 5-card stud poker, with stakes starting at $500 per hand. Aldrich initially experienced moderate success, but as stakes increased and alcohol flowed, he made increasingly reckless bets. By midnight, he had lost more than half his stake but continued playing with desperate intensity. The other players, following Philippe's instructions, allowed him occasional wins to keep him at the table while gradually increasing pressure. The final hand began just after 2 a.m. Aldrich was dealt what appeared to be a strong hand, a pair of kings showing. Confident, he pushed his remaining $3,000 into the pot. But the other players had stronger hands and had coordinated their bets to ensure the final pot would completely bankrupt him. When cards were revealed, Aldrich's pair of kings lost to a full house held by a cold-eyed stranger. As reality sank in, Aldrich sat frozen. The stranger remained seated, studying him. After oppressive silence, the stranger spoke with a slight French accent. "Mr. Aldrich, I believe we need to discuss your outstanding obligations. The gentlemen who just departed represent certain business interests that have been patient with your financial difficulties. But patience, like luck, eventually runs out." At that moment, Philippe Deveau stepped from the shadows. Aldrich's blood turned to ice as he recognized the resemblance to his murdered brother. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Jeremiah," Philippe said. "Perhaps because you have. My name is Philippe Deveau. I believe you knew my older brother Marcus quite well. In fact, you were the last person to see him alive, weren't you?" The warehouse felt impossibly cold. Henri Rochelle emerged from another corner. "My father Samuel always said you were clever, Mr. Aldrich. Clever enough to murder 2 men and steal their life's work, but apparently not clever enough to realize dead men sometimes leave behind sons who remember their father's stories and never forget their father's killers." Aldrich sat paralyzed. Philippe continued, "We know everything. We know about the Delta Trading Company, the warehouse murders, the forged documents, the bribed witnesses, the systematic theft. Most importantly, we know you've been living on blood money for 11 years. Henri produced a leather folder filled with documents, bank records, property transfers, correspondence with corrupt officials. The evidence was overwhelming and authentic. The question now, Philippe said, is what we intend to do. We could turn this over to federal authorities, or arrange for certain parties in New Orleans to learn you've been living a lie. Either would result in your death, probably preceded by considerable unpleasantness. Aldrich whispered, "What do you want?" "Money. I can get money. My plantation." "Your plantation is worthless," Henri interrupted. "We hold the mortgage, along with most of your other debts. We've been systematically acquiring your obligations for years. You have nothing left to bargain with except your life. And we're not particularly interested in preserving that." The warehouse grew colder. "There is, however, one alternative," Philippe said. "One way you might be permitted to continue breathing for a while longer. It would require a certain sacrifice of dignity, a public acknowledgement of your true nature and complete submission to our authority." Henri smiled with cold satisfaction. "You're going to marry one of your slaves, Jeremiah. Publicly, legally, and permanently. You're going to stand before God and Louisiana society and take your cook, Celeste, as your lawful wedded wife." The suggestion was so grotesque Aldrich initially couldn't process it. Marriage between a white plantation owner and an enslaved person was social annihilation. "You're insane," he whispered. "No one would ever, it's impossible." "Actually, we've made arrangements," Philippe replied. "There's a minister in Natchitoches Parish heavily in debt to certain gambling establishments. He's agreed to perform a legal ceremony, properly witnessed. Louisiana law is clear. Marriage contracts, once executed, are binding." Henri leaned forward. "The beauty of this arrangement is it gives you a choice. Refuse and face immediate consequences for your crimes, considerable physical pain. Or accept temporary humiliation in exchange for continued life, however degraded." Aldrich wrestled with the impossible decision. Death would be final but preserve some vestige of his reputation. Marriage to Celeste would destroy every aspect of his social identity while leaving him alive to endure years of humiliation. "How long?" he finally asked. "If I agree, how long would it last?" Philippe and Henri exchanged a look. "For the rest of your natural life, Mr. Aldrich. Though, given your age and health problems, we suspect your natural life might not extend as long as you hope." The implication was clear. They were offering a slow death disguised as marriage. But the alternative, immediate execution, body dumped in the river, seemed worse. "Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in this Louisiana warehouse intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. After what felt like hours, Aldrich raised his head. "If I agree, what guarantee do I have you won't simply kill me anyway?" "None whatsoever," Henri replied. "But you have our word your death, when it comes, will be more pleasant than what we originally planned. Think of the marriage as an opportunity to demonstrate good behavior. Compliance will be rewarded with kindness. Resistance will be punished with creativity." Philippe produced a marriage contract. "This is ready for your signature. The ceremony is scheduled for tomorrow evening at Willowbrook, where all your neighbors will be invited. They've been told you've experienced a religious conversion and wish to demonstrate Christian charity by elevating a slave to wife. The final humiliation, presenting the marriage as his own choice." Aldrich signed with shaking hands, trying to convince himself he might find an escape. But he could see the satisfaction in their eyes. They had planned this for over a decade. "Welcome to the family, brother-in-law," Philippe said. "We'll see you tomorrow evening. I trust you'll dress appropriately." The morning of March 15, 1854, dawned grey and oppressive. Aldrich had not slept, pacing his study and staring at the contract. Celeste had been informed but pretended surprise when he awkwardly explained. She listened patiently, then nodded. "Yes, Master Aldrich, I understand. I'll prepare myself." Her calm acceptance terrified him. Throughout the day, neighbors arrived, drawn by invitations sent in Aldrich's name. Most expected a joke or evidence of mental instability. Instead, they found a properly organized wedding. Aldrich played his role with desperate conviction, repeating explanations of religious conversion. Celeste appeared in a simple but elegant gown, carrying herself with dignity. She seemed genuinely pleased, smiling graciously. The minister performed the ceremony efficiently. When he asked if anyone objected, several guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. The most disturbing moment came when the minister pronounced them husband and wife and instructed Aldrich to kiss his bride. His face went pale, but Celeste steadied him, rising to meet his lips in a brief, chaste kiss. As guests departed, bewildered, Aldrich found himself alone with his new wife. Celeste moved through the house with confidence, rearranging furniture and belongings. When Aldrich protested, she fixed him with a stare. "We're married now, Jeremiah. Husband and wife, partners. I think it's time we started acting like it, don't you?" That first night, as they lay in the same bed, Aldrich understood his tormentors had devised a punishment far more sophisticated than death. He was trapped in a daily reminder of his powerlessness, surrounded by constant presence of someone who knew exactly what he had done. But the true horror was yet to come. The marriage was not the culmination of Philippe and Henri's revenge, it was merely the beginning. The first month passed with deceptive normalcy. Celeste managed the household efficiently, entertained the few visitors who still called, and maintained social pretenses. But Aldrich noticed subtle changes. His coffee had a bitter aftertaste, meals left him nauseated and tired, he experienced headaches and dizziness that worsened in her company. Initially, he attributed this to stress. But as weeks passed, his condition worsened. His suspicions were confirmed when Dr. Hamilton Warren examined him after he collapsed. The diagnosis: symptoms consistent with chronic poisoning, prolonged exposure to arsenic or similar metallic poison. Without treatment and removal from the source, it was invariably fatal. Confronting Celeste would be dangerous and pointless. She was protected by her legal status and her connections. Instead, Aldrich took precautions, preparing his own meals in secret, avoiding anything she prepared, sleeping in a locked guest room. These measures provided temporary relief but created new problems. Neighbors commented on his gaunt appearance, nervous behavior, and reluctance to eat or drink in his wife's presence. Word spread he was showing signs of mental instability. Celeste played her role masterfully. When guests expressed concern, she responded with patient worry, behaving like a devoted wife whose efforts were rejected by a man losing touch with reality. Her approach made Aldrich's defensive actions appear as paranoid delusion rather than reasonable caution. His attempts to explain were dismissed as ravings of a man driven insane. By late spring 1854, Aldrich was trapped, being slowly killed by a woman he was legally bound to live with, while every attempt to protect himself was interpreted as proof he was losing his mind. But the psychological torture continued. Philippe and Henri had designed their revenge to include complete social isolation and the destruction of every relationship. The truth was revealed in the most cruel way during a dinner party Celeste organized for their 3-month anniversary. She had invited neighbors and Dr. Warren. Aldrich, paranoid, had eaten secretly beforehand. But Celeste announced a special surprise: a bottle of wine aging in the cellar, opened in front of all guests. She proposed a toast. Aldrich, unable to refuse without appearing insane, raised his glass. As he did, he caught sight of her eyes. For a moment, her mask slipped, revealing cold satisfaction. The effects began within minutes: severe stomach cramps, difficulty breathing, burning in his throat and chest. He collapsed at the table. Guests assumed they were witnessing his final breakdown. Dr. Warren tried to examine him, but Celeste threw herself across his body, sobbing and begging for help, Her performance so convincing guests comforted her instead. As Aldrich lay dying, Celeste leaned close and whispered, "Marcus Devo was my cousin. Samuel Rochelle was my uncle by marriage. I've been working with Philippe and Henri since 1845, waiting to watch you die the way you made them die, slowly, painfully, and completely alone." The revelation added a final layer of horror. Every moment of apparent domestic tranquility had been part of an elaborate performance. As his vision darkened, Aldrich could hear Celeste continuing her performance, begging Dr. Warren to try harder, pleading with God. Guests offered comfort, completely convinced they were witnessing a tragic accident. Jeremiah Aldrich died at 9:47 p.m. on June 18, 1854. Dr. Warren's official cause: natural causes associated with prolonged nervous exhaustion. The funeral was well attended. Celeste played the grieving widow with such conviction that prominent ladies offered to help manage Willowbrook. No one suspected she was celebrating the successful completion of an elaborate murder plot. But the story didn't end there. Philippe and Henri had planned for every contingency. As Aldrich's legal heir, Celeste inherited Willowbrook and its debts owed to them. Within a month, she signed documents transferring ownership to Philippe and Henri in exchange for debt forgiveness. She then disappeared, presumably heading north with enough money to start a new life. Official records raised no suspicions. The story became a minor footnote in local history. But among certain families, a different version circulated for generations, a warning about betraying business partners whose relatives were intelligent and ruthless enough to spend a decade planning perfect revenge. Philippe Devo and Henri Rochelle had achieved something remarkable. They prosecuted a murder case no court would touch, executed a death sentence no judge would impose, through methods leaving no evidence. Their success required patience, intelligence, financial resources, and a complete understanding of Louisiana's social and legal systems. Willowbrook Plantation's transformation provided final evidence of their thorough planning. Rather than selling for profit, they converted it into a refuge for freed slaves and escapees, a station on the Underground Railroad. The plantation house that once entertained Louisiana's elite now helped enslaved people reach freedom. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect was how completely they erased Jeremiah Aldrich from history. His wealth was redistributed to victims' families, his property converted to purposes contradicting his values, his reputation destroyed through his own actions. His death ensured no one would remember him as more than a failed plantation owner who made poor decisions and married unwisely. No monuments, no family line, no historical record of his crimes. He was deleted from Louisiana history as if he never existed. This mystery shows us that justice sometimes operates outside legal institutions, particularly in societies where those institutions protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.